So moving along, we're going to hold a panel now looking at, we're going from the exciting, disruptive, change the world message from Alex to the regulators. Doesn't that sound exciting, right? We're going to talk about how do we overcome the regulation is a major, major issue for this space. It's been the ongoing theme for crypto for some time. How do we grapple with a completely outside of the box technology that just doesn't fit there's a square peg trying to fit into a round hole of technology. So we've got a jam-packed panel, a bunch of folks who've got some interesting ideas on there. Why don't we just all come out? Go Combiz, Michelle, Jason, Tom, and Lisa. What I want to do is actually talk about the actual financial challenge of this to start with, because getting compliant, if you're a startup in this space, being consistent with the law is actually a really costly exercise. So, in fact, maybe Michelle, since, Ripple has been sort of driving this, you've been sort of dealing with compliance officers for some time. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about what that experience is, and just a very, very brief introduction as well as to what you do for Ripple. How about that?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm Michelle Bond. I'm the Global Head of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Ripple. Ripple is a cross-border payments company, and we are changing the way money moves globally by using the power of blockchain technology. And I would say compliance is absolutely at the core of our business. Our company is not consumer facing in any way. All of our customers are actually banks and payment providers. So these are all the financial institutions. And given that they are financial institutions, these are heavily regulated entities. These are entities that have very extensive AML and KYC requirements. These are entities that are used to having regulators even, sitting in-house at times. So that's something that we're heavily, focused on. Ripple itself actually is also regulated. So we have a New York State Department of Financial Services BIT license, and we're regulated by FinCEN as a money services business. So I would say compliance is really part of the everyday of what we do. And yes, it's absolutely a costly exercise, and it's something that we're really focused on.
I mean, how can you give us, without giving away the magic sauce, like what sort of burden is it, financially? I mean, the compliance business.
So I don't have dollar amounts,
right.
But it's part of everything that we do. So we have to make sure that we're compliant. We're looking into our customers to make sure that they're compliant, that we check them against OFAC lists. We also make sure that they're up to speed on all of their licensing requirements. And the fact that our customers are located in over 40 jurisdictions, that doesn't make it any easier because now you have all of these differing regulatory requirements, because as we all know, the U.S. is very different from a lot of other countries, so it's certainly something that makes the fabric a lot more complicated.
So when I hear these sorts of stories, I'm always struck by, okay, so great, Ripple's, you're a pretty well-funded venture-backed firm. You also have raised, you've got XRP, which is worth something. So you've got quite a bit of money, right? So that gives you this unique competitive advantage against, say, a little startup that just has to come up against that massive wall of coming up with the money just to get through the door, right? So I thought, Jason, you might be able to weigh in on this, since you're there talking to startups, talking to government at that space. Again, an introduction just briefly, but your thoughts on how do we grapple this cost element of compliance?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Jason Brett. I'm a former regulator with the FDIC. And I have my own think tank in DC that we founded in June of this year called the Value Technology Foundation. And it works on both open and closed blockchain systems, cryptocurrencies, everything, and looking to make sure that Congress and regulators understand that there are legitimate people working in this space and get through some of the regulations. The first thing that occurs to me, Michael, is that when I was a regulator at the FDIC, very often community banks would have this challenge. So sometimes the regulators would work to have less of a compliance burden on the smaller organizations. But another solution that can work too is for, whether it's the American Bankers Association or the ICBA, is to group the community banks together and offer a service, sort of a compliance as a service that can be spread. So for instance, every new company maybe spends $100,000 and they add up to $1 million that can then pay for a service that might be provided to all 10 of the quote unquote community crypto banks. And that's one of the ways I think that is going to need to be addressed, because you are going to need a strong compliance solution, because there's two issues going on here. One is we don't even know exactly what the firm regulations are. So the money you're spending, we don't even know. That might change the next day. And in fairness to Michelle and Ripple, you can spend a lot of money in DC and still mess up. And I will just sort of say out loud, and it was talked about on the Hill a lot, that Facebook didn't do the best job this year with all the resources they could have. Still got a lot of egg on their face from some fumbles that they made. So it's not only important to have the funding, but it's important to have the right people and the right strategy. And I would say to be willing to work with the regulators and to understand what they're looking for. They're not looking to stop you from doing business. They're looking for you to check the box. But the biggest thing of all, and I think you could probably speak to this too, Thomas, is this idea of, the regulators want you to check a box, but they're not going to tell you how to do it. So that's up to us in the industry to figure out.
That cue there, Thomas, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so what he's talking about in particular is a kind of a thorn in what we call VASPs or exchanges their side, right? It's called the travel rule. So exchanges in the past, all they had to do was just do maybe some blockchain analytics, but they would just accept the address kind of as is. Now the exchanges actually have to send that customer information along with every transaction and receive it. So all of that is part of this record-keeping initiative undertaken by FinCEN and under the BSA Act. But this is a huge technical challenge in terms of how do you actually verify what is an exchange versus a hardware wallet or any kind of different business model. So I think cooperating with different types of entities, and from regulators all the way down to the exchanges themselves, to build out a proper solution is critical. And it's time sensitive too.
Right.
Yeah.
So what you're alluding to there is this, a much more collaborative process, right, between the regulators who are setting these rules. And we hear all the time that, US government policymakers, they hold up this high ideal that they want to protect consumers, they want to maintain the security of the financial system, but they also want to maintain innovation. They understand that, so they say that you need to create the right space for innovation to bloom. But that story just gets completely distorted sometimes. So how do we bring both sides together? And I think, Lisa, since you are actually sort of looking to run for Congress, you are running for Congress, what as a policymaker would you bring to the table to try to bring both sides together and get a much more collaborative approach to regulatory change?
Well, as a business owner, I advocate a free market approach. Free market is the birthplace of innovation and disruption, and that's exactly what blockchain is and represents, and that's exactly why we're all here this week at CES. So in advocating that, let's face it, our current representatives, our elected officials, the majority of them are not familiar with modern business, they're not familiar with modern technology, and they aren't advocating for it. We all watched the Facebook hearings. So with keeping that in mind, what does that type of regulation look like? And I think it has to be balanced. It has to be an ideal sort of regulation. It's the bear on the leash that we have to maintain and control. And it's, of course, protecting the consumer, but it's also making sure to allow for a space for innovation to flourish and not be a roadblock to entrepreneurship in and of itself within this industry.
Okay, and Combs, you're also engaged at that level.
Yeah.
What sort of advice do you bring to startups, but also to government to try to you're formerly at Deloitte, you've had this role. What do you do to bring a collaborative approach?
Sure. So I'm Combs Abdurrahimi. I currently work at Deloitte. I was a former regulator working with Treasury of the White House, the Senate as well, advising on sort of what the regulatory frameworks would look like to enable these innovations to achieve mission impact at scale. Now at Deloitte, I advise governments, federal, state, local, international, as well as companies on looking to sort of adopt, accelerate these emerging technologies, whether it's blockchain or AI, and sort of, again, to achieve that mission impact at scale. I would say that part of the problem, I think, when we started this panel that you talked about, which was the cost element of compliance, it's pretty exorbitant. I mean, we get, again, we advise not only governments, but businesses, and so they come to us and they're like, we have this amazing business case, a phenomenal solution that's going to, empower consumers, it's going to make business better, it's going to make government better, and how do we get fully compliant with what are the laws and regulations that govern sort of this new technology? And it's really difficult for even a huge company like Deloitte to, sort of give that advice because the regulations and the laws haven't really kept up with the technology, the pace of the technology. And I think it's exactly Lisa's point, is that you have policymakers and regulators who are, not as familiar with the technology, and that's a challenge. We get estimates of costs for compliance just from financial services anywhere between 50 million to 500 million a year. And when you're talking about in the US, our regulatory framework is very disparate. Every state has its own sort of jurisdiction. So you have like maybe 50, 60, 70 jurisdictions. You have federal laws, know your customer, anti-money laundering. There's there's lots of regulations, and there isn't a lot of guidance out there publicly for, say, startups or new companies that, again, have those new innovations, but they can't afford a company, say, like Deloitte or, one of these, Big Four to advise them. So it's finding the right balance.
So how do we live up, how is the United States living up to this claim that they are, enabling innovation when you've got sort of these massive hurdles? But on the other hand, of course, we've seen so many scams in this industry, right? So that the public view is, of course, they should be regulated. Look at these guys; they're the fraudsters of all fraudsters, which of course is a very narrow reading of what's going on underneath and all the hard work that goes to the technology and everything else. But the messaging is that. So how do we? What's sort of you guys who are there talking to politicians? Is there a willingness to sort of take a different view, or they just feel like they're constantly sort of defending the little guy again?
I don't think you want to regulate them out of existence or regulate them so that they move overseas, because that's what you see now, is companies that cannot get fully compliant with our regulations, and they want to be, but it's like going to the regulator, going to the Hill, asking, begging for advice and recommendations, and not getting that advice, and they're like, well, I don't want to be slapped with a whether it's sanctioned by, FinCEN or, one of the regulators. I'll just move overseas to a friendlier jurisdiction that allows innovation to flourish.
And I wouldn't actually say that the problem is necessarily that we're seeing a lot of over-regulation. I think there's a lack of regulatory clarity, and I think that's what the real problem is. So I don't think that that's giving industry an opportunity to say, okay, well, here's what the guidelines look like, and this is what I need to do in order to abide by the rules. People can't do that in the industry now because there isn't a clear regulatory framework. In fact, in the United States, I think is the biggest, unfortunately, the biggest culprit. And I was a lawyer at the SEC. The SEC is, one of the regulators in this space, and certainly they're looking at digital assets and, trying to figure out which digital assets are securities and which ones aren't. And they put out a guidance actually last April to talk about the classification of digital assets. And it basically took the Howey test, which defines what an investment contract is for SEC jurisdiction, basically, and expanded a 4-factor test into over almost 40 factors.
Wow.
And that's tough. I mean, that makes it really hard to try to figure out, well, is this or is this not going to be, more likely to be a security or not, and that makes it very difficult,
Which is just so difficult for the end user, right? So my bakery, Sin City Cupcakes, we were the first bakery in the Las Vegas Valley to accept Bitcoin. And we were all excited about it because Nevada released a couple of years ago that they weren't going to be taxing cryptocurrency. And so we were like, cha-ching, let's go ahead and accept it. And we literally called the AG's office here in Nevada, and we were like, so what do we need to do, right? What do we need to do? How do we implement it? And they were literally like, what are you talking about? So we like send them the link, and we're like, you guys said it's legal, like this is what we're doing. They had no infrastructure and no response in relation to what does actual implementation look like on the back end as bakery owner, right, as the business owner. And so we just made up our own rules, which is what entrepreneurs do, right? We figured it out. Do you guys remember the Airbits wallet? That's what we used. We used an Airbits wallet as our very first wallet to accept Bitcoin with the bakery because there was no guidance, no clarity. It was just, here's the message on some obscure federal website that this is now allowed, and that was it.
And actually, the industry is trying to come up with their own approaches. So like, for example, the Crypto Ratings Council was created, and they said, you know what? The regulators aren't getting this right. We're gonna fill that gap, and we're gonna determine what is and isn't a security and decide what to list. And it was mainly the exchanges that had come up with a framework. So certainly, the industry is trying to step in. I think the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, is actually doing, I think, a really good approach because they're trying to do something that's more principles-based, and at least then, as the technology evolves, they won't have to keep changing their regulatory frameworks, and it'll be more adaptable. So that's kind of what the CFTC is looking at, but it's definitely a challenge. And internationally, I would say though that there are regulators that are doing a great job in getting it right.
So Compass, you referenced this, this idea that this is a very mobile technology. It's a mobile industry, a mobile community, and open source communities, the technology basically resides nowhere in many respects, right? So the idea that I can just pick up and move somewhere else becomes more, attractive in that environment. So I don't know, maybe Jason, you can weigh in because you've been looking at this from the perspective of China and what it's doing in terms of all of its research. How real is the threat to the United States that this technology just basically gets picked up everywhere else?
Well, I think it's real. The question is it actually going to come to fruition or not? And we don't know. One of the things we advocate at the Value Technology Foundation is we even have a chief technology officer, and we're working to create a research and development center here in the US that can provide the same type of focus on blockchain technology that's done in other countries now, because we don't have anything like that. If you take a step back and you think about the idea of the Chinese wanting to do a digital currency, what's important is, as regulators and in policy, we have to think one step ahead. So let's say China next week, you're all over it, and CoinDesk announces that they've launched the digital currency, that it's out there. So does that mean that we can walk into our 8-year-old's room and seeing them purchase a Chinese digital currency, which we didn't think about before? When I was in banking, the biggest thing was always like, don't mess with people's kids and don't mess with people's money. With the internet, I think you saw it messing with people's kids. Now we're messing with people's money, right? And so it's a whole new challenge, and it's really important too that we think about in this country how we want to regulate it and how we want that framework to be. Because if we have the SEC or the CFTC involved, to me that's a really good thing, even though the SEC can be somewhat law enforcement based. We're talking about maybe putting utility coins in the FTC, Federal Trade Commission. We're talking about maybe putting digital cash under the FinCEN. These are federal enforcement agencies. It's kind of like if you have a building and a building inspector shows up and say, I want to inspect your building. That's like the SEC and CNC. It's okay, you're going to inspect the building. But what if a police officer shows up and inspects your building? That's a whole different type of paradigm. So I think it's important that we think about how we're training our regulators and what sort of framework we have to make sure that it's not something that we are punishing those who are innovating and work with them. I actually think all of this is a really good sign for the industry. The fact that there's all this regulation coming out. I'll say this, that when I was at the FDIC, the expression all the bankers had when we go in to examine them was, we're happy to see you here, Jason, and we're glad to see you go. So, we're here, it means you're in business, and then we're happy when you leave in a week and give us a good report. So.
If I can add one thing,
yeah, sure.
I would say it's like a national security imperative, right? You don't really hear that thrown around when it comes to like blockchain. You hear that a lot when it comes to artificial intelligence, where the White House put out the executive order on AI, and we want to sort of encourage federal agencies to adopt and implement it at scale so that we don't fall behind. I think that's what we need for blockchain. We need some sort of champion within the federal government to really advocate for this technology. And I think with that sort of advocacy comes the public-private partnerships, the consortiums that can be formed to spread the cost of regulation that is, again, it's still pretty high compared to other jurisdictions. And I'm not saying rightfully so or not, but I think that there should be kind of a level playing field with startups and established companies looking to get a license to start their business. But it's like if you're an established company or an entity, you have like significantly more leg up than you would as a startup. We need to basically empower budding entrepreneurs and startups, because that's where the creativity and the innovation is coming from.
Now, though, Tom, they're not like every jurisdiction out there that sort of looks like it's opening the doors to all these crypto wonderkins is not necessarily as friendly as it seems. Because I mean, Switzerland, which we've all pointed to for some time as being a place that is proactively trying to cultivate this industry in many respects. We talk about there's Crypto Valley and Zug, and there's a FINMA has definitely had that's the Swiss regulatory agency, a generally friendly approach. But they've just announced some, I think, rather disturbing news from those of us who have wanted to think of crypto as a own your own bank, control your own money sort of thing. Can you weigh in on this for us?
Yeah, so last year, actually, FINMA, which is the main regulator in Switzerland for financial markets there, they announced that they're banning basically hardware wallets, which are non-custodial wallets. You own your own private key. This is a major news for the entire industry because it basically stops people from being their own bank. You have to keep your assets on a major centralized exchange. And so, I mean, you wonder why that's doing it. Play devil's advocate here. Regulators want strong markets. And if you look even back to the Bitwise report to the SEC on fake volume versus real volume, look at all the failed ETFs, right? Regulators are looking for solid markets. And how do you do that? You actually have good institutions. You have good laws that build the institutions, and those institutions build the markets themselves. So if you solve some of these AML issues at the very beginning, you can actually begin to have much more mature markets. What happens when you have mature markets? You bring in more fintech players. You bring in a lot more institutional money. With blockchain, with those two married together, you're going to start to see some really interesting innovation. You can actually start to spend your USDC or your stable coins at stores. You can do different things with a more advanced, mature market. So there is some cons to this, right? Especially from the more libertarian crowd, but there's also some very, very positive developments and silver linings within this development as well.
So I don't know if Alex Mashinsky is still in the room, but I think he'd probably take issue with this.
Right.
That, in the sense that it is this core principle of Bitcoin, at least, and any of the imitators, that you start with that absence of an intermediary. That is the whole point, right? And I think there's a whole range of interesting programmable money aspects and smart contracts and cool things that can be done with otherwise custody-based digital money. So it's not as if nothing radical is happening. But to many who have seen this issue as sort of the critical point, you're left with this, what are we doing then, right? But maybe, Lisa, since you've got some Bitcoin ATMs as part of your business interest as well, right? I mean, how does, that's supposed to be a place for somebody to come in and out of cash and have that fluid relationship. How does all this ambiguity fit into the Bitcoin ATM world?
It makes it incredibly difficult. And I mean, here in Nevada, not only the state, but also certainly the Las Vegas Valley, it's tried to be really supportive and embrace, especially just Bitcoin ATMs. I think right now there are approximately 117 Bitcoin ATMs around the valley. 18 months ago, there were like 60. So we're seeing this increase in people wanting to be supportive of blockchain and cryptocurrency. But the state of Nevada came out and they said, well, of course, regulation. So you need to make sure that you're in compliance, right? And so that's the know your customer, that's making sure that you have identification on everybody. And And as a result, you have some of these ATMs and these transmitters that were specifically designed to not have to have your driver's license scanned onto it, right? That's why people were using these ATMs in the first place, which lends itself into that other side of, is there money laundering going on? There's, all these other issues. So you're seeing a divide in just the ATM community where some people are saying, well, they haven't even given us what a clear definition is of how we're supposed to be utilizing these ATMs. They have 2 distinct Nevada statutes right now under NRS, and one is related to if you are a money transmitter and there's an exchange going on within the machine, then you have to be compliant with KYC and all this other stuff in AML. However, if you only either store it or there's a one-way transaction where it's like accepted in, but it's not gone back out to another wallet address. Now you're just holding it, and now you are treated as a trust under NRS, which is not subject to all the other regulations. So which one is it, right? Where do people fall in line? And so you have people deciding upon themselves where they fall, and I don't think that should be our place, not if we're gonna get sanctioned for it or get fined for it.
And that's just clear. Nevada.
And that's just Nevada. Yeah, exactly. That's just Nevada. The lack of clarity.
A place that knows about money, though, yes.
And too, what I think is really important, and hopefully Michelle will back me up on this, is someone who's running for Congress talking about all this. I don't think there's anybody like that in Congress now. They want to understand it. Most of the time, we spend most of our resources when we're on the Hill. What's blockchain? What's cryptocurrency? To get into the weeds is what's needed, because people forget that in Congress, they work hand in hand with the regulators. It's not like they're detached entities. So, I think to have someone, this can turn the tide with the regulation of having more folks in DC who actually can understand the Bitcoin ATMs, who've run a business, who understand the wallets. So that way, when Michelle and other companies come to her, it's not like, okay, here's what blockchain is, and then there's no more conversation because they just don't understand it. Oh, it's just used by terrorists. She'll actually understand the business need, and that's really important.
But is the dream of own your own bank dead? I mean, do we just have to just live with the reality that we're going to have KYC and AML and regulations and everything else? Combiz, what's your take on this dream that some people hold?
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily my dream, I would say. I'm not saying, I guess that, I'm not saying that we should not have any sort of regulations or know your customer, anti-money laundering, but these regulations were written 40 years ago. They were written in a time where, we didn't have sort of facial recognition technology, mobile phones technology to open up bank accounts. So again, as technology is evolving, the policies and regulations need to evolve. And that's where I think it's important to have sort of policymakers and regulators engaged with industry. Industry can go to them, startups can go to them and say, look, I have this use case, I have this business that I want to do, this is how I'm going to do it, can this be compliant? And getting answers. I think it's just like getting the information, getting the guidance, getting the clarity is needed. But I do think we need to kind of move in that direction of faster payments. We have comparatively speaking to the rest of sort of the developed economies, we have one of the slower payment systems in the world.
Right.
We put together a faster payments task force, a secure payments task force, this and that, and it's like we meet and we talk, but it's like, okay, we need to accelerate it. We need to push it forward because from a national security standpoint, from a financial empowerment standpoint, other countries are moving ahead very fast, and we're a bit slower. But I will say, in all fairness, we do have, I don't know how many, 8,000 whatever banks in the U.S., financial institutions. Other countries, say Estonia, whatever, they might have just a handful. So it's a lot easier in other jurisdictions to kind of push a faster payments rollout than, say, the U.S. But that does not mean that then we should still be,
On the payment side, using blockchain and a digital asset, it usually takes, 3 to 5 business days to do a cross-border payment now under, on RippleNet and ODL, on-demand liquidity, our product. It can be done in a few seconds, and that's the power of the technology, and that's very meaningful. The point that you were just making, I mean, look, when the internet in the 90s was being developed, the regulatory framework that was in existence was designed for transistor radios and rotary phones. That had to be updated, and it was successfully updated, and we have the internet now. That needs to be done again, and I think we can do it.
Yeah. So one thing, when you're talking about we're in this new age with all these tools now, I mean, so there is another way to think about these problems. It's like, do we just make it easier through the technology itself? Like the reg tech industry itself is there to say, yes, we can still presumably get compliant, but rather than having to spend, however many millions of dollars on lawyers and all these others, the machines can do it for us. Like you've got this concept of a compliance in a box, Tom. Why don't you tell us a bit about what that's about and how do we use technologies and other things to, bring down the cost and the efficiency of living up to what the law requires us to do?
Well, as been discussed in this panel, a lot of these laws were written, 40 years ago, even in the 30s. But modern technology has really come a long way to help that facilitate those kind of compliant requirements. Cloud infrastructure makes basically it redundant. It's a virtual crashless computer. Cloud technology, any kind of API technology, any types of, even blockchain technology itself can be applied to RegTech itself. So the technology is there. Actually, that's not much of a problem. What is there is the governance, it's the business models, and actually the cooperation. Our businesses, do they want to comply? A lot of the directors from the original exchanges don't necessarily want to comply, so it becomes a very difficult problem even just to have a regulation or a kind of RegTech in a box kind of solution, because a few lines of code won't solve something like the travel rule. There's going to be some really interesting interoperability issues with that. So that's a human problem. That's not necessarily a few lines of code or even AI can even solve.
Okay. But are there any things that we, what about Ripple? Have you looked into different RegTech solutions, Michelle?
Yeah, there are several that people can use, and I actually think that's one of the beautiful things about blockchain is just how well it can be traced, actually. So, so there are different tools out there like Chainalysis and Cipher Trace, and a lot of people in the industry use them to do monitoring and tracing of transactions, and actually you can run analytics on the transactions that have been done, and that can be helpful for AML purposes. So there are different RegTech solutions that the industry is using, and when the industry is using them, the regulators use them too. So, which I think is a good thing. Yes.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. As a regulator at the FDIC, you'll see these, whether it's sensitivity to market risk or whatever you're measuring, if you see that solution come across and you're familiar with it, you can just check the box and understand what it is. I think that it's really important that we have a company like Ripple that's taking the lead in terms of helping to create what kind of regulations can be used. When I was at the FDIC, the concern we had was when these large banks came together, like Wachovia, Wells Fargo, it would take 3 to 6 months if one of them, if the Wells Fargo we know today would fail, to figure out what everyone's deposit insurance was. So my first blockchain use case that I brought to the FDIC was, why don't we use this to trace people's customers' deposits and make the banks use some sort of blockchain technology so we know on a Friday this is what everyone has, because no one's going to wait 3 to 6 months, to get their money once a large bank like that does fail. There was they do those systemic risk reports for the really large banks. One of the reports was 100,000 pages long to go through. 100,000 pages. So there's an opportunity for RegTech.
Whoa. One way to get to sleep, I think that's guaranteed sleep tool there.
And if I could add one thing. So I think blockchain as the value of blockchain in sort of regulatory compliance and RegTech is like enormous, and you can use, say, blockchain-based systems for KYC validation. So the reason for like the exorbitant costs of compliance is that financial institutions, money service businesses, payments companies, they have to constantly verify and validate that know your customer AML information and data. Sometimes it's even done manually. It's not like there's not like a digital process. With blockchain, you can essentially validate that information. The validation component use case of blockchain you could use that, and it could lower. I mean, it'll lower costs. But I would say this is like, say, if you're a financial institution and you're using a blockchain or an AI-based KYC system, say you've developed it in-house, or you've got, what's that authority to operate look like? Where do you go to, if you have a regulator, an in-house, banking regulator looking that you're using this, latest technology tool, they're going to have a lot of questions, So again, it's like getting the regulators maybe comfortable or sort of, more engaged with the clients or the customers that are adopting these sort of innovative technologies. Because they want to be compliant. All these businesses, everyone wants to be compliant. And it's just, they need that, the engagement, I think, with the regulators is key.
Now, without wanting to get, political here, let me get political. What, if anything, would the impact of, we're moving into an election year here, and there will be changes of government, both within the legislature and maybe at the executive branch, we'll see. Is this a bipartisan problem? Is this something do we think that maybe, there could be a change if there was a change of the structure of Washington? Any thoughts, anyone?
I think with just, advocacy for more elected officials to come from these other sectors, right? Come from private business, come from small business, come from blockchain community, come from fintech. There's an opportunity here for regular folks like myself to come off the sidelines. And no, I don't have any former political experience. I didn't hold a seat with the state assembly and then work my way up through the state senate, and then now I'm gonna run for Congress. I'm running for Congress. And it's because I care about this community, and I think that we severely lack a real voice around small business, how these regulations affect small business, and what we can do to make our communities better through technology.
I don't think it's a partisan issue. You have Democrats, Republicans, Independents, they're all sort of united. Like, look, we've got antiquated systems, we need modernization, we need innovation. There's numerous, Senate, congressional caucuses on, say, whether it's blockchain or AI. You have, support within, previous administrations, the current administration. You have very innovative, regulators like the CFTC. I love the CFTC. I mean, they're just, they're very, they get it, they understand. So I don't think it's a partisan issue, and it shouldn't be, because but if it becomes a partisan issue, then you're going to have, I think, challenges and problems. So it's best to kind of leave the politics out of it.
We're running quick on time, but one last quick comment, From both, yes.
I think it's important that we're in an election year, so you have to understand that the heads of the agencies are politically appointed, right? So if you actually have a new administration in there, you're going to have new people in front of Treasury, for example. Steve Mnuchin will be out. What does that mean for what they're doing currently with AML, right? So those are some concerns we have.
Yeah. Do you want to have a last word there, Brett?
Yeah, just, I think it's been relatively bipartisan, but this year we're starting to see a little bit of a break, mainly because of Facebook and Libra, because now stable coins are a real concern of how that could affect the consumer, and the Democrats are really focused on ways of regulating. They have a bill of Managed Stable Coins Act or securities, while the Republicans, which we never thought we'd hear any politician actually talk about the virtues of Bitcoin over stable coins. So we're seeing a little bit of that, and again, it's just the way this so many changes in this market. But I think,
well, if anything, it means that we've got some interesting times ahead as the political winds blow in whatever direction they do. So a round of applause, everybody, for this fabulous panel. Thanks, guys.